7 days of relentless agony would break any sentient mind in the Orion Spur. Bones shattered, nerves scorched, and mindscapes shredded by neural whips. Yet strapped to a cold titanium slab, Jacob Mitchell spat a tooth onto the pristine deck, looked at his captors and grinned. "Good stretch. When do we start?" Jacob Mitchell was not supposed to be here. Officially, he didn't exist. Unofficially, he was a senior test pilot and Black Ops contractor for a joint initiative between DARPA and Lockheed Martin's Advanced Interstellar Division. His mission had been a standard deep space reconnaissance run near the Alpha Centauri exclusion zone, piloting the experimental F-119 Starglider. It was a beautiful piece of machinery, coated in radar-absorbent metamaterials, and powered by a classified zero-point drive reverse-engineered from early contact debris. But standard missions didn't involve getting ambushed by a cruiser the size of Manhattan. His co-pilot William Stanton had barely managed to eject the ship's telemetry core back toward Earth's defense grid before their vessel was swallowed whole by a localized gravity tractor beam. Stanton had been killed in the initial boarding action, taking 3 of the pale, elongated hostile boarders with him in a hail of depleted uranium rounds. Mitchell had been stunned, stripped, and dragged into the bowels of the alien dreadnought. Now he was the guest of honor in a sterile, painfully bright interrogation theater. His captors belonged to a highly advanced, rigidly hierarchical species that the United Nations Space Command simply designated as the Overseers. They were tall, frail creatures with translucent skin and large obsidian eyes that betrayed no emotion. They communicated in a series of clicking harmonics, translated by an implant in Mitchell's neck into cold, synthesized English. The interrogator assigned to Mitchell was a creature of high rank, draped in a shimmering, iridescent uniform. For the past week, this interrogator had systematically attempted to dismantle Jacob Mitchell, piece by biological piece. They wanted the bypass codes to the Aegis orbital defense arrays constructed by Northrop Grumman and SpaceX, the very shield that kept Earth hidden and safe from the wider hostile galaxy. They fundamentally misunderstood what they were dealing with. On day 1, they had utilized gravity manipulation. The interrogator had secured Mitchell to a vertically inclined slab and dialed the localized gravity field to a crushing 3 Gs, fully expecting the human's internal organs to rupture and his spirit to break within minutes. Most species in the galactic community evolved on low-mass worlds. A 3G environment was tantamount to being crushed under a planetary crust. Mitchell had just closed his eyes and regulated his breathing. 3 Gs. He remembered his early days at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, strapped into the human centrifuge. General Clayton had pushed his recruits to 9 Gs just to see who would pass out first. 3 Gs felt heavy shore. It made his chest tight and his muscles scream with lactic acid over the course of hours. But it was just a prolonged pressure suit exercise. He flexed his calves rhythmically, clenching his leg and abdominal muscles, using the anti-G straining maneuver, AGSM, to keep the blood flowing to his brain. When the interrogator finally dropped the field 12 hours later, expecting a liquefied corpse, Mitchell had simply gasped, rolled his shoulders against the restraints, and asked for a glass of water. Days 2 and 3 were dedicated to thermal torment. The Overseers, being reptilian adjacent in their biology, required strict thermoregulation. A drop of 10 degrees was lethal to them. They sealed Mitchell in a glass cylinder and vented ambient liquid nitrogen gas into the chamber, dropping the temperature to a staggering -40 degrees Celsius. Frost formed on Mitchell's eyelashes. His breath crystallized in the air. His body began to violently shiver as his core scrambled to protect his vital organs. But he didn't break. Instead, his mind drifted back to his SERE survival, evasion, resistance, and escape training in the unforgiving wilderness of Alaska. He remembered the ice water plunges the days spent hunting in whiteout blizzards with nothing but a combat knife and a fire starter. Human bodies were absurdly adaptable engines of thermodynamic defiance. He focused on his heartbeat, slowing it down, entering a state of zen-like endurance. Frustrated by his survival, the interrogator reversed the polarity on day 4. The temperature skyrocketed to 55 degrees Celsius. The air became a dry, burning furnace. Blisters formed on Mitchell's exposed skin. Severe dehydration set in. The overseer technicians watched their monitors in absolute disbelief as the human's body did something horrifying. It began to excrete water through its skin to cool itself down. To the alien, sweating was a bizarre, biologically expensive freak show. To Mitchell, it was just a harsh Tuesday afternoon deployment in the Mojave Desert testing flight suits for Boeing. It was miserable, yes. His head pounded with dehydration and his lips cracked bleeding sluggishly. But he wasn't going to give up the Aegis codes just because someone left the thermostat on high. By day 5, the physical torture shifted to kinetic strikes. Automated mechanical arms delivered calculated bone-bruising blows to his torso and limbs. They mapped his nervous system, striking major nerve clusters to maximize pain without causing fatal internal bleeding. It hurt like hell. His ribs were bruised, and his left collarbone was fractured. But humans are apex predators from a death world, bred from a long lineage of persistence hunters who routinely ran their prey to death over broken terrain. Pain was just an electrical signal, a biological suggestion that something was wrong. Mitchell had learned to mute that signal years ago. Your physiological resilience is an anomaly. The interrogator's synthesized voice echoed through the sterile chamber as day 5 bled into day 6. The alien stood safely behind a reinforced kinetic barrier, observing Mitchell's battered, bruised body. But flesh is irrelevant. It is the mind that holds the truth. And your mind is unprotected. Mitchell spat a glob of blood onto the floor, the red fluid staining the pristine white tiles. "You guys talk too much," he rasped, his voice hoarse from dehydration. "Are you going to ask me a question, or are we just going to keep doing this weird alien CrossFit?" the interrogator signaled to 2 technicians. "We are finished with the physical. Now we break the construct of your reality." Day 6 marked the beginning of the psychological assault. The overseers prided themselves on their mastery of neurointerrogation. They didn't just ask questions. They invaded the victim's mind, tearing down their psychological defenses, weaponizing their deepest fears, and extracting information directly from the temporal lobe. They wheeled in a towering machine that looked like a chrome metallic scorpion. At its tip was the neurospike, a crystalline neural induction interface designed to bridge the gap between organic brains and alien data mining algorithms. The technicians forced Mitchell's head back, locking it into a vise. The interrogator approached, holding the crystalline spike. "This will bypass your pain receptors and stimulate the amygdala, the fear center of your primitive brain. You will experience 1,000 lifetimes of your worst nightmares simultaneously. You will beg to give us the coordinates." "Sounds like my last marriage," Mitchell muttered, gritting his teeth as the spike was driven into the port at the base of his skull, a standard DARPA neural jack he used for piloting the Starglider. The connection was instant. The world dissolved into a blinding white light, followed by a descent into absolute darkness. The alien machine attempted to isolate Mitchell's darkest fears and amplify them. It expected to find simple primal terrors, predators, the dark suffocation, isolation. But the human mind is not a simple ordered filing cabinet. It is a chaotic, sprawling labyrinth of contradictions, trauma, compartmentalized memories, and bizarre coping mechanisms. When the interrogator's psychic algorithm breached Mitchell's subconscious, it hit a brick wall of cognitive dissonance. Humans endure a baseline level of existential dread that would paralyze most galactic species. The alien machine tried to project the terror of mortality into Mitchell's mind, but Mitchell had already made peace with his death years ago during a botched halo jump over hostile territory. The machine pivoted, attempting to weaponize guilt. It pulled up the memory of William Stanton's death on the Star Glider. It forced Mitchell to watch his co-pilot die over and over, trying to crush him under the weight of survivors' guilt. But Mitchell was a soldier. He had undergone extensive psychological hardening. He didn't break. He compartmentalized. The grief was there, sharp and agonizing, but he locked it in a mental steel box, wrapped it in chains of duty, and pushed it to the back of his mind. For 48 hours throughout Day 6 and Day 7, the battle raged entirely in the neural landscape. The interrogator, remotely linked to the machine to observe and extract the data, found itself drowning in the sheer, unadulterated noise of a human consciousness. The alien was exposed to the chaotic barrage of a 21st-century human brain. It felt the adrenaline spikes of combat, the caffeine-induced anxiety jitters of a 40-hour work week, the crushing stress of a looming mortgage, the phantom pains of old injuries, and the bizarre looping fragments of pop music that played incessantly in the background of Mitchell's thoughts. The psychic feedback was deafening. To an alien species that thrived on absolute mental order, calm and collective synchronicity, Mitchell's mind was a radioactive wasteland. The machine pushed harder, dialing the neural stimulation to fatal levels, trying to force a psychotic break. It simulated the feeling of burning alive. Mitchell countered it by reciting the technical manual for the Lockheed F-119's propulsion system from memory, mentally retreating into a fortress of pure logic and extreme focus, a technique taught by DARPA's Advanced Psychological Warfare Division to resist cognitive hacking. The harder the machine pushed, the more the feedback looped back into the interrogator's own linked consciousness. The alien began to physically tremble. It was experiencing second-hand human anxiety, a terrifying cocktail of existential dread and suppressed rage. By the dawn of Day 8, the machinery began to whine its cooling systems, failing to keep up with the massive processing power required to navigate the labyrinth of human trauma. With a loud, sickening pop, the crystalline neurospike overloaded. A shower of blue sparks erupted from the terminal, and the heavy metal scorpion arm recoiled. The psychic link was severed instantly. The interrogator staggered backward, clutching its head with long, trembling fingers. A thick, dark fluid began to ooze from its auditory orifices. The alien dropped to its knees, hyperventilating, completely overwhelmed by the psychic whiplash of Mitchell's suppressed nightmares. It looked up at the human, its dark, emotionless eyes, now wide with a very recognizable expression: absolute terror. Mitchell hung from his restraints, his head slumped forward. His breathing was shallow, his body covered in sweat-dried blood and severe thermal burns. For a long, silent moment, the only sound in the interrogation room was the frantic clicking of the panicked alien technicians and the harsh, ragged intake of the human's breath. Slowly, agonizingly, Jacob Mitchell raised his head. His eyes were bloodshot. The capillaries burst from the extreme gravitational and neural pressure. His face was a mask of bruises and cracked skin, but there was a terrifying predatory spark alive in his pupils. He rolled his jaw, feeling the satisfying pop of a dislocated joint sliding back into place. He spat a shard of a shattered molar onto the pristine deck, looked down at the trembling interrogator, and allowed a bloody feral grin to stretch across his face. "Good stretch." Mitchell rasped his voice, vibrating with a dark, mocking energy that made the remaining aliens instinctively step back. "When do we start? Was that the warm-up?" The silence in the interrogation theater was absolute, broken only by the frantic, wet gasps of the interrogator, bleeding dark fluid onto the deck. The two alien technicians stood frozen, their bioluminescent skin flashing in rapid, chaotic patterns of distress. They had never seen an interrogation fail. They had certainly never seen a subject weaponize their own psychological trauma to short-circuit a Class 5 neurospike. Mitchell didn't give them time to process the paradigm shift. While the machine had been busy trying to fry his amygdala, Mitchell had been working on a more physical problem. The intense thermal fluctuations from days 2 and 3, combined with the mechanical impacts of day 5, had weakened the microstructural integrity of the titanium alloy restraints clamping his left wrist. Furthermore, human bone density is an evolutionary marvel. By intentionally dislocating his thumb and leveraging the fractured collarbone, he had created just enough slack in the biomechanical lock. With a sickening crunch that echoed off the sterile walls, Mitchell wrenched his left hand free, stripping a layer of skin off the back of his hand in the process. He didn't even flinch. The pain was just data. The objective was survival. He reached across his chest, his muscular, blood-smeared arm, moving with a terrifying predatory speed that the low-gravity-evolved overseers simply could not track. He slammed his palm into the emergency release biometrics of the right restraint. The heavy metal clamps hissed and retracted. Mitchell dropped to the deck. His legs, atrophied from 8 days of suspension, buckled for a microsecond. He caught himself, his bare feet slapping against the cold metal. Normal gravity on this dreadnought was about 0.8 Gs, a fraction lighter than Earth. To Mitchell, it felt like taking off a heavy rucksack after a 50-mile march. He felt weightless. He felt lethal. The first technician lunged for a wall-mounted alarm panel, its long, spindly fingers extending frantically. Mitchell crossed the room in 2 massive strides. He grabbed the creature by its elongated neck. There was no hesitation, no cinematic pause. He squeezed, applying the kinetic force necessary to crush a human windpipe, and was mildly surprised when the alien's cervical vertebrae simply turned to powder in his grip. The creature crumpled to the floor dead before it even registered the strike. The second technician produced a small, sleek sidearm, but Mitchell was already moving. He ducked the chaotic burst of superheated plasma that scorched the wall behind him. Pivoting on his heel, Mitchell delivered a devastating roundhouse kick to the alien's thoracic cavity. The impact sounded like a baseball bat, shattering a pane of glass. The alien flew backward, its fragile ribcage caved in, pinning it against the shattered remnants of the neuro-interrogations machine. Mitchell stood alone in the room, with the gasping, terrified interrogator. He picked up the discarded plasma sidearm, weighing it in his hand. It was practically weightless, lacking the heavy, comforting mass of a human-made Colt or Sig Sauer, but it would do. He walked over to the interrogator, grabbed the shimmering fabric of its uniform, and hauled the creature upright. "You made a fundamental tactical error," Mitchell whispered, his voice a gravelly rasp. He dragged the interrogator toward the primary console, a glowing interface of floating holographic glyphs. "You thought my mission was reconnaissance." The interrogator clicked weakly, its translation implant sparking. Your vessel? Unarmed. Scouting. The F-119 Star Glider is a joint project between Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works and DARPA." Mitchell explained, his tone conversational, despite his battered appearance. "It wasn't unarmed. I was the weapon." Mitchell shoved the alien's hand onto the biometric scanner of the console, bypassing the lockdown. The holographic interface bloomed to life. "Did you really think the United States Space Command would let a pilot with Aegis orbital defense codes fly near a hostile border without a failsafe. Mitchell laughed, a harsh, dry sound. We knew you were out here. We knew you were snatching ships. Project Damocles wasn't about avoiding capture. It was about getting caught by a high-value target. Mitchell reached to the back of his neck, his fingers brushing the bloody rim of his neural port. That little neural spike you jammed into my head, my implant, isn't just for steering a ship. It was engineered in a sub-basement at Fort Meade by US Cyber Command, aided by predictive AI models from Palantir. It holds a localized polymorphic worm, a hyper-aggressive digital pathogen modeled after Stuxnet but scaled for quantum architecture. The interrogator's large black eyes widened in absolute horror as the implications set in. The interrogation wasn't a breach of the human's mind. It was an unencrypted direct-line injection vector into the Dreadnought's central mainframe. When you hooked me up, I wasn't fighting your machine, Mitchell said, tapping the console. I was stalling. I needed 48 hours of unbroken connection for the payload to unpack, bypass your firewalls, and root itself in your navigation and life support subroutines. You didn't torture me for a week. You gave me a quiet room to dismantle your ship. Right on cue, the ambient lighting in the interrogation theater shifted from a sterile white to a pulsing, angry crimson. A deep, resonant klaxon began to howl through the decks of the massive cruiser. The holographic glyphs on the console in front of them turned a sickly green, reforming into a single rotating symbol, the insignia of the United States Space Force. What have you done? The interrogator gurgled, dark fluid bubbling at the corners of its mouth. I just disabled your kinetic shielding, dropped your 0-point drive offline, and broadcasted your exact spatial coordinates on an unencrypted subspace channel back to Earth, Mitchell said, checking the plasma pistol's charge. The warm-up is over. He put a single plasma bolt through the interrogator's head, dropping the alien to the floor. Mitchell didn't look back as he stepped out into the chaotic, flashing corridors of the Dreadnought. It was time to go to work. The interior of the Overseer Dreadnought was a labyrinth of sweeping organic curves and polished obsidian metal, designed for beings who found aesthetic pleasure in flawless geometry. Right now, that flawless geometry was flashing with emergency lights, the ship's internal PA system shrieking in a language Mitchell couldn't understand, though he recognized panic when he heard it. He moved through the corridors with the lethal efficiency of a ghost. At Fort Bragg, they had taught him how to clear rooms. In the deep black of space, the principles remained the same. Keep your silhouette small, check your corners, and never stay in the fatal funnel of a doorway. He encountered his first patrol at a major junction. 4 Overseer soldiers clad in light shimmering combat armor and wielding long-barreled pulse rifles. They were moving frantically, clearly responding to the systemic failures cascading through their ship rather than looking for an escaped prisoner. They didn't even see the human drop from the overhead ventilation struts. Mitchell landed squarely on the shoulders of the trailing soldier, his body weight snapping the alien's spine instantly. Before the body hit the floor, Mitchell had the plasma pistol up, firing twice into the center mass of the next 2 guards. The superheated bolts punched cleanly through their light armor. The 4th guard spun around, bringing its rifle up, but human reflexes, honed by thousands of years of predatory evolution and decades of intensive combat training, were vastly superior. Mitchell didn't shoot. He closed the distance in a blur, stripping the pulse rifle from the alien's weak grasp, reversing the weapon, and driving the heavy stock into the creature's faceplate. He stood amidst the bodies, breathing heavily. He swapped his pistol for the heavier pulse rifle, slinging a bandolier of charge packs over his bare, burned shoulder. He checked his internal chronometer, a subdermal implant in his left wrist. The distress beacon had been active for 12 minutes. The cavalry would be here soon, but he needed to make sure this dreadnought didn't manage a blind hyperspace jump before they arrived. He needed to find the bridge. Using the ship's panicked, internal automated responses as a guide following the flow of heavily armed reinforcements, Mitchell navigated the sprawling ship. The malware he had unleashed was doing its job perfectly. Doors sealed shut randomly, gravity fluctuated in certain sectors, and life support pumped excessive oxygen into the corridors, making the atmosphere hypercombustible. Finally, he breached the command sector. The blast doors were sealed, but a few well-placed plasma bolts to the hydraulic lines forced them open with a screaming hiss of pressurized air. The bridge was massive, a multi-tiered command center, dominated by a sweeping panoramic viewport overlooking the star field. Dozens of overseer officers were frantically typing at consoles, trying to isolate the human virus that was eating their ship alive. At the center, elevated on a command dais, stood the shipmaster. He was taller than the others, his uniform adorned with intricate gold wiring. He turned as the blast doors hissed open, his obsidian eyes locking onto the battered, bloody, heavily armed human stepping onto his bridge. "Concentrate fire," the shipmaster shrieked, the translation software booming over the bridge's speakers. But Mitchell was already in motion. He didn't seek cover. He became the storm. He opened fire with the pulse rifle, laying down a suppressing barrage that shattered consoles and sent the fragile officers diving for the deck. The overseers were commanders, tacticians who fought starship battles from millions of miles away. They were completely unprepared for the brutal kinetic reality of a human boarding action. Mitchell moved through the room, methodical and ruthless. He didn't waste shots. He used the chaotic layout of the bridge to his advantage, flanking the security detail before they could establish a firing line. Within 2 minutes, the bridge was utterly silent, save for the crackle of electrical fires and the groans of the dying. Mitchell walked up the ramp to the command dais. The shipmaster lay on his back, clutching a severe plasma burn on his abdomen. He looked up at Mitchell, his expression a mix of agony and sheer disbelief. You are barbarians," the shipmaster gasped. "A primitive, violent species. We will extinguish your world for this." Mitchell stood over the alien commander, the barrel of the pulse rifle resting casually on his shoulder. He looked down his bruised face, devoid of any sympathy. "That's the difference between you and us," Mitchell said quietly. "You look at the universe and see variables to be controlled. You think logic and technology make you superior. You think a week of pain is enough to break a species that spent its entire history inventing new and exciting ways to destroy itself." Mitchell crouched down, getting right in the shipmaster's face. "We fought trench wars in the mud. We dropped atom bombs on our own cities just to end a conflict. We strapped ourselves to rockets filled with high explosives just to touch our moon. We are not barbarians, shipmaster. We are the apex predators of the Orion Spur, and we take it very personally when someone touches our boats." Suddenly, the massive panoramic viewport at the front of the bridge flashed with blinding localized Cherenkov radiation. The darkness of space tore open in a dozen different places, a phenomenon caused by the simultaneous arrival of massive slipspace ruptures. Out of the void emerged the retaliation force of the United States Space Force. Leading the charge were 3 Olympus-class heavy cruisers, their hulls bristling with kinetic mass drivers designed by General Dynamics and directed energy weapons from Raytheon. Flanking them were dozens of agile destroyers and interceptor squadrons. The Aegis array had not only received the beacon, Admiral Hayes had brought the entire Pacific Theater defense fleet. The dreadnought's sensors, severely compromised by Mitchell's malware, shrieked a belated warning. "They're here," Mitchell said, looking out at the magnificent, terrifying display of human military might. He looked back at the shipmaster. And your shields are down." The shipmaster's eyes fluttered despair, finally overtaking the pain. "What? What do you want?" "I want a ride home," Mitchell said, turning away. "And I want you to remember that the next time you look at Earth, you look away." Mitchell tapped a sequence into the command console, sealing the blast doors to the bridge and locking the navigation computers into a hard reset loop. He then made his way toward the hangar bays. He knew exactly where they would have parked the Starglider. They wouldn't have destroyed a piece of tech that advanced. 15 minutes later, the sleek, black, aerodynamic shape of the F-119 Starglider blasted out of the Dreadnought's hangar, leaving a trail of blue ionized exhaust in its wake. Mitchell engaged the stealth baffles, smoothly accelerating away from the massive alien ship. He keyed open his long-range comms, dialing into the encrypted USSF frequency. "Aegis Command, this is Starglider Actual. Authentication code Whiskey Tango Foxtrot 9. Requesting vector for approach." There was a moment of heavy static, followed by the unmistakable gruff voice of General Clayton. "Mitchell, son of a bitch, I thought we lost you. We tracked your beacon. What's the status of the hostile Dreadnought?" Mitchell looked over his shoulder. In the distance, the USSF fleet opened fire. Massive slugs of tungsten, accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light by the mass drivers, slammed into the unshielded hull of the Overseer Dreadnought. The alien ship buckled, explosions blooming across its surface in silent, violent flashes of light. "Hostile Dreadnought is currently undergoing an aggressive, unscheduled disassembly. General..." Mitchell said, a weary but genuine smile touching his cracked lips. He leaned back in his pilot's seat, the adrenaline finally beginning to fade, replaced by the deep, aching exhaustion of a man who had been to hell and back. "Copy that, Starglider. Welcome home. Medical teams are standing by. Are you injured?" Mitchell looked down at his burns, his bruised ribs and his mangled hand. He thought about the interrogation room, the cold slab and the alien who thought it could break him. "Just a few scratches, sir," Mitchell replied, pushing the throttle forward. "Honestly, I think I just got warmed up." If you enjoyed this descent into human resilience and absolute defiance, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We bring you the most intense, high-stakes HFY sci-fi stories every single week. What did you think of Mitchell's escape? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans to help the channel grow. See you in the next adventure.